Good morning, my name is Jeff Hunter from VMware. I work in the tech marketing group in the storage and availability division of VMware. I focus more on the availability side. If you're wondering what technical marketing does, we're some of those folks that put out the white papers, blog articles on VMware.com. You'll see some out there. We put those articles out there. We focus more on the technical aspects versus the marketing aspects. So don't let technical marketing confuse you, because I know it sounds kind of crazy, right? Like, what is that? But anyway, that's what we do. And again, my name's Jeff. I'm going to actually turn things over to Ken so he can introduce himself, and he'll get you started this morning, or this afternoon officially. Thank you.
Yes, I guess so. Good afternoon. So I too am a senior architect in the technical marketing division. A lot of the things that Jeff and I cover are really the full scope of business continuity and disaster recovery. For the last few years, I've been focusing mostly on Site Recovery Manager, on vSphere Replication. Jeff and I are both fairly active on Twitter, well, moderately active on Twitter if you want to read about, oh, that was a great dinner that I just had and things like that. But we also have a blog, and ignore the tweets from about 3:45 a.m. last night if you are going to follow us. Just, those don't exist. We also have a blog where Jeff and I and one of our colleagues, GS Kalsa, post a lot of material, which is the Uptime blog. And you can access that from blogs.vmware.com/uptime, where we post a lot of things like tips, tweaks, exposure of broader functionality, get into detail about certain things ranging from high level all the way down to this is how we load buffers into a queue and then unload them for transport, waiting for maximum transfer times and things like that. So it's a pretty good resource from a few of us there. But today we'll be talking about Site Recovery Manager version 5.8 that we've just released and getting into some of the technology there, and vSphere Replication 5.8 as well. It is a technical session. We obviously can't get right down into the code level, so we're going to talk to the technology, and we'll absolutely have time for questions if you want to get further down into these things. We have a microphone. We'll only be able to take questions from the microphone at the end of the session because the sessions are being recorded, so we need to make sure that those get captured. So how many people here are using Site Recovery Manager today? Boy, this is fantastic. Pretty much the whole room. How many people have never seen Site Recovery Manager before? Cool. Okay, so just a couple. Great. That means we can really dive right into the technology itself. So first I want to kind of position where these products sit within our storage and availability stack. We can't really talk anymore about storage without talking about availability. How do we put things onto disk is one aspect of our data protection and our data storage. So it is storage and availability as a holistic unit within VMware now. And a lot of the way we're transitioning our products over the years is towards a model that somewhat like what you see on the screen here. We'll have a data plane. And at this data plane level, you've seen some of the announcements that we have around things like vSAN, virtual volumes, object-based storage, all the rest of those components. Those set the foundation for our availability stack, because what they do is fundamentally at the core level, they're providing a data plane that can distribute our writes out. If you look at things like vSAN, we have storage policy-based management of vSAN where we can dictate things like availability policies at that data plane level. But the data plane itself provides the means of instantiating our data, which can then be it can then interact with data services. And this is where we start talking about things like replication, like data protection, like various components that we have at that stack that enable us to protect the virtual machines. But this is a service that is offered from the data plane. And then at the top level, we have policy-based management. So things like Site Recovery Manager, which is not a data service. What it is an orchestration engine that instantiates policies for disaster recovery. So the way we're transitioning our product set is to really look at this sort of a level. And things like replication are considered a data service. Things like Site Recovery Manager are considered policy management. So those are the two pieces that we'll be talking about today, particularly replication as a data service and Site Recovery Manager. So SRM 5.8, very brief overview of this for the about 3 people that haven't seen SRM in the audience. As I mentioned, it is an orchestration engine. This is a DR tool that allows us to control the sequencing of recovery, the process by which we recover an environment after a failure. And it doesn't necessarily need to be a failure. We have different models of really data center movement of information from one site to the other that SRM controls via policy. So it allows us, first and foremost, to do disaster recovery. If we have a failure at a site, we can bring that environment over to another site in a controlled, tested, sequenced fashion. But thankfully, disasters are fairly infrequent. So what we actually see is that most of our customers are using it for these two other types of use cases. Disaster avoidance. We understand that something is going wrong in the environment or may go wrong in the environment in some point in the future. Floodwaters are starting to look kind of, treacherous. We don't have the kayaks for our servers, things along these lines. Ice storms are rolling in. I'm Canadian, so I worry about ice storms a lot, but it keeps me awake, really. I just can't get over these ice storms. Anyway, but thirdly is planned migration. If we need to move data sources from one site to another in a controlled fashion for things like data center movement, data center migration, workload mobility and migration between environments. We're retiring an old data center, we're moving to a new data center. The same recovery plans can be used for disaster recovery as can be used for data center migrations and disaster avoidance. The point is that SRM gives us a controlled recovery time objective that is known. We know exactly how long it will take for our outage and to bring it back online because we can test it. So within SRM, we have recovery plans. These recovery plans are the sequence by which we restart our environments. And these recovery plans can be run in a few different modes, let's call it. Failover. Something's gone wrong, we hit the panic button, we hit the red button, disaster has impacted our systems. We recover in that known set of steps with a known set of time. We can take the same recovery plan, though, the same one that we would use for disaster, and run it in test mode. And what this will do is create an isolated environment that doesn't impact production at all on the recovery site, isolates the network, isolates the storage, and we go through the sequence, the same sequence that we would for a disaster in a test environment. Third use case is planned migration, as I mentioned. It's the same recovery plan again. The point is, through all of these different modes, we want to make sure that we're following the same steps every single time so that we're not dealing with configuration drift and all the rest of these things. Planned migration will run the same recovery plan, shuts down the servers on the primary site, mounts the storage on the recovery site, powers on the VMs. But it differs from a DR, or a failover, in that it will stop if there are any errors. It has a slightly different goal, which is consistent data at the recovery site, and we might have a little more time to ensure that our primary goal of consistent data at the recovery site is met. So it will stop if something goes wrong, you fix the error, you can run it again and again and again until you have consistent powered on data at the recovery site. And the last one is failback. After we've moved over to the one site, after we've gone to our DR site, usually things like disasters are transient, or we might just be moving it out of harm's way for disaster avoidance, and then we want to move it back. SRM gives us one button called reprotect, which reverses the direction of replication, protects the environment back to the primary site, and then we can run a planned migration or a failover back to the initial site. So it's literally two buttons to get your environment back to its initial state. And then you run reprotect again. So that's SRM in a nutshell. The high-level run and gun view. Since everyone here is fairly familiar with SRM, let's talk about what's new. 5.8, we've released a couple of new features that are broadly categorized in about 3 different areas. DR for the software-defined data center, things like VCO workflows that I'll talk about in a lot more detail that give us automation for things like protection and running various types of workloads. Protection of vSAN, protection of that data plane component called the virtual SAN. We have enhanced scale that I'll go into a lot more detail on as well, and also some very, very nice improvements in terms of performance. And the third area is in terms of operational efficiencies that we're introducing with SRM 5.8 around things like the UI, management of things like IP addressing, and installation. So let's take a look at the first ones. I've mentioned VCO. SRM 5.8 has now got the ability to understand VC orchestrator workflows that are inbound to SRM. Is anyone using VCO in their environment today? A handful of people? Okay, that's pretty good. Orchestrator is a great tool for running repeated types of processes where we take a sample type of a workflow that might be something like scan our data stores for unprotected virtual machines. We might want to do that on an ongoing basis. One of the orchestrator workflows that we now have with SRM is VCAC integration. Now, this integration takes the form of being able to automate the protection of systems that we're deploying through vCloud Automation Center, or vRealize Automation. So the point is that it's a plugin for Orchestrator. So we have a handful of different aspects to this. We have a plugin that allows Orchestrator to communicate with SRM, and that works for pretty much everything that the API of SRM exposes. And we have a plugin for vCAC that allows us to put some custom properties onto our blueprints that we're deploying, our catalog items, so that when they are deployed, they will be automatically configured for protection by Site Recovery Manager. So obviously, this is a pretty nice functionality for those of you who are using vCAC. Again, audience participation. Who's using vCAC? Well, all 4 of you will be very thrilled about this function then. It's a pretty nice tool to have. And in fact, that's one of the limitations that people have had with vCAC in particular in the past, is saying, well, great, I've automated all this provisioning and all these things are going out beautifully, but then I need to manually go protect this environment after the fact. So this is a pretty nice workflow that you customize. This is we really give you like a workflow for vCAC that's sort of generic. You need to take that and adapt it to your environment and put in your own pieces. So we load these 2 packages into VC Orchestrator. We then run this workflow that will attach to your blueprints and put a post-provisioning step onto it, that when you deploy that catalog item, this post-provisioning workflow behind the scenes transparently goes out to VC Orchestrator, which goes out to SRM, and automatically protects that virtual machine. So there's some setup involved in loading these packages in, and as I mentioned, customizing it to your environment. But after that's done from the user perspective, it's fully automated out upon deploy, which is very nice, because part of the problem is that when people are deploying systems, they might not know anything about the DR side. The DR people might not know anything about that application. Well, now IT can bake in things like this catalog item can only be deployed onto a protected data store. End of story. That's all IT needs to do. Now the application owner, when they deploy their configuration, knows that it will be protected because they have no choice in the matter. So it automates things for everybody on both sides of the stack. So for example, if we're deploying a configuration from vCAC, let me make sure I got the laser here and that it's pointing in the right direction. We'll see things like this box here start to show up, custom properties that give us priorities. So SRM has the ability to define the priority of a given virtual machine for start sequence. Priority 1 starts first, priority 5 starts last. So now I'm deploying this catalog item called Ubuntu 12, and all I need to do is choose what the priority is for it within SRM. Configuring it, which data store, all the rest of that stuff, bouncing back and forth between DR and IT and application owners, that's done. It's just simply a matter of selecting the priority, and the VM is automatically protected. It is running, as I said, workflows behind the scenes. They're just standard VC Orchestrator workflows. If you're familiar with Orchestrator, this should look fairly familiar to you. You can customize these. You can edit them. You can change sequences. You can add extra functions. You can pull them out to suit your environment and the automation that you need. Add authorization and authentication steps, all the rest of that type of stuff that we can do with Orchestrator. So behind the scenes, this is really a VCO workflow, not necessarily a vCAC SRM type of integration. But as I've mentioned, this is Orchestrator. Orchestrator now has full visibility into almost everything in the SRM API. So we can do other types of things with this Orchestrator workflow. We can do things like create protection groups in a programmatic fashion. We can find protected data stores. We can find VMs that are not protected but are sitting on replicated data stores. There's a situation that we see every so often where people have deployed a new virtual machine onto a protected data store. That's part of an SRM priority group, but they haven't configured it to be actually protected, creating the placeholders and doing the mapping and all the rest of those things. And that throws an error off. Well, why don't we run a workflow once a day that will look for unprotected VMs sitting on replicated data stores, add them to SRM. No user intervention required. It's a good cleanup type of a tool. So we can do all sorts of things with this integration that we couldn't do in the past. Whoops, let me go back to that with SRM. And we give you a whole bunch of different types of workflows out of the box for VCO and SRM integration. So that's pretty nice, right? Good. Scale. With SRM 5, we supported 1,000 virtual machines to be protected. There was a certain patch for ESX that we could then bring that total number up to 1,500 protected virtual machines. Anyone running up against that limit in the room? Yeah, there usually aren't many people that put their hands up, but when they do, they put them high. With SRM 5.8, we now protect up to 5,000 virtual machines with a given SRM instance. Now, with 5,000 virtual machines protected, that obviously, that's almost a 5x increase over the way it was in the previous iterations. We can still support recovery, though, of 2,000 concurrent virtual machines. Reason is if we try to protect 5,000 VMs and have a single recovery plan with a single protection group with all 5,000 VMs in it and they're all priority one, you're going to sink all sorts of things on the recovery side. Your VCs are just going to choke. The host D processes are going to be unhappy. There's a lot of stuff that goes on. So we've tested this to 2,000 concurrent recoveries, but that doesn't mean you can't protect more than 2,000 VMs. It just means if you're trying to do a recovery, 2,000 is where we draw the line for now, and you have to stage out that. Not a big deal, right? Maybe it is for you, the sole audience member who wants 5. Okay, scale improvements, that's wonderful. We've also introduced a handful of very, very nice key critical performance improvements that I'm going to go through and tell you all about. We have errors on the screen here around. We've got file system locking. We used to hold the file system when we were doing our resignatures of the data stores and when we're doing the failovers. We've changed some of the way this works so that we're no longer doing semaphore holds when we're doing the resig, and we also have other things when we're doing rescan of all the HBAs for our servers. We used to hold onto the file system as well as just the data stores themselves, which we don't need to do any. We've got control calls VSI. We're using a caching VSI mechanism instead of using a. We're batching our API commands through SRA now, so that if through the SRAs to the storage adapters themselves, so that we don't have to do things in sequence. We can do them in parallel. There are lots of performance improvements. Nothing huge within SRM, nothing huge within the storage platform or within the vSphere hosts. We've done a whole bunch of tweaks, a whole bunch of extensive tweaks throughout the platform through an iterative process from our quality engineering team, through our core development, through our CPD teams, through, I wish I could take credit, but I wasn't involved. So I had nothing to do with it. Just trust me, there are lots of performance improvements. But the net result of all of these various components changing gives us a 75%, up to a 75% faster RTO. So the recovery time objective, which is the most critical aspect of disaster recovery, can be shrunk down dramatically with this type of a change. So this is huge for us. Has anyone done storage level failovers? A lot of large environments with lots of HBAs and data stores. Takes some time to do all those unmounts, the rescans, the mounts, all the rest of that type of stuff. With the tweaks that we've introduced to this, that drops hugely. So you're probably thinking, you said up to 75%. Nice weasel words, Ken. I don't trust you. That's funny to you? So our QE guys were doing some testing against this. They had 250 protection groups. And those are protection groups. There are lots of data stores within these protection groups. 2,000 VMs with IP customization turned on. And we're seeing drops in total time. Roughly half included for the overall total time, but a lot of that is going to be in the IP customization. But take a look at the storage time operations. 17 hours, 15 minutes, down to 4 hours and 13 minutes. That is an enormous amount of time saved from an RTO, just doing things like file system rescans and HBA rescans and mounts and unmounts and all the rest of that stuff that we don't need to be doing during a disaster. So dropping the recovery time is absolutely enormous for us, right? Cool? Any questions on that? All right. Wonderful. Operationally, we've made a handful of changes to SRM as well to make it easier, as I said, to manage, to get installed, to get up and running. For example, we now have the option to use an embedded vPostgres database on the SRM server rather than having to go out to an external database. You can still do that. That's wonderful. We're not taking that away, but just to get things up and running quicker, have that embedded database as an option as well. And that supported up to the full scale of SRM. We have a new UI for Site Recovery Manager as well. I believe you'll be pleased to hear, we're now using the web interface like every other plugin for, I wasn't always expecting applause for that one, but we'll see. So yeah, it's beautiful. It looks very familiar for some of you who've used the web interfaces for some time. We have some very nice graphs and charts and things like that. It works apparently with ESX Server 2.1, and apparently people here have been using VMware for a while, right? Yeah, it's not the MUI, no. It's the standard web interface that we're using for everything else, as I said. So nice new look and feel, crisp, integrated management. You can you don't need to go popping between the thick client, the vSphere client, and the web client, and all the rest of these things. Standard tabs that you see everywhere else, the manage, the monitor, related objects, all those components that we're familiar with. The core functionality doesn't really change within SRM because we've gone to a website. You'll still see exactly the same types of screens when you go to run a recovery plan and select the type, forced recovery, plan migration, whatever it happens to be. The workflows themselves still look the same because they are still the same. They haven't changed just because we changed the UI. We did take the opportunity to make some tweaks to it. So for example, populating drop-downs that used to perhaps drop off the bottom of the screen. It's easier to access things, just minor housekeeping events like that. But yes, it's a standard UI that we have in that space as well. How many people have to customize their IP addresses if you fail over? Yeah. How many people have a static, spread VLAN where you wouldn't need to? Okay, about a handful of people. For those of you who've had to customize your IP addresses on failover, people were pretty happy that we have these tools to do it. You can go through the UI, customize your VMs one by one, which is great when you've got 1,500 VMs that you need to customize on failover. We have this awesome tool called DRIP Customizer. Has anyone used this one? Everyone who has used this loves this because we've kept the functionality and the syntax exactly the same through every release. I'm kidding about that one. We have this awesome habit of changing the syntax to address requirements. And you create your CSV files where you go in and you edit your IPs, you add extra NICs, and then you run the command. Very, very seamless, easy to understand, fun for people to use. And you'll be pleased to know that this functionality still remains. So you can do it through this mechanism, and there is a reason for this, right? If you're doing massive bulk changes, it's much easier to maintain a massive sheet, basically, of what the IP should be. But to enhance this functionality, we've introduced IP subnet mapping. And what this gives us is the ability to set rules within our network maps. So if I have a certain subnet range, 10.1.1.x, that is going to change to 192.168.10.y, or whatever it happens to be, we simply map the subnets from one to the other. And any VM that sits within that rule set will be changed automatically when it fails over to the recovery site. So, in this case, I've got a rule called 10.10.10 to 192.168.1. You simply mask off the octets or the range that you wish to retain, and the VMs will automatically swap those that are not masked off. We'll retain those that are not, it will swap the ones that are not masked off, and it will retain those that are masked. So 192.168.1.1 becomes 10.1.1.1, and so forth. And we can do this for all the subnets that we've got. We don't need to go through and customize VM by VM. We don't need to go through DRIP Customizer to change those things. We can set these rules as mandatory, as we can override it and say, automatic, for example, if there is a rule in place, we'll use it. Otherwise, we'll use what's already been edited within that virtual machine itself, and on and on and on. So simplifying that DRIP customization for failover is an enormous success for those who have to go through that IP change on failover. Much, much quicker and easier. We'll take questions towards the end. We could probably pause between the sessions, between the VR and SRM components. Cool? Is that nice? Good. I like that one. vSAN interoperability with Site Recovery Manager. We had this before vSAN was released. So really, this isn't new functionality, but now all of these products are out and it works. But it only works through vSphere Replication. Because it's a software-based array, it can only be protected by our software engine. But vSphere Replication inherently understands those storage policies that we can create. So if we're using a vSAN as a target for DR, for example, we can create rule sets. Failure to tolerate of 2 hosts, flash reservation cache of 3%, whatever it happens to be. And when we protect the virtual machine to a vSAN, you simply select the storage policy that you want to protect the VM to, and it will protect it to that policy. And vice versa. If we're doing a failback, we can do the same thing. We can reconfigure them for failover and failback. And because SRM understands VR inherently, SRM gets the benefits of vSAN's policy-based management through vSphere Replication. Completely 100% 100% supported. There's nothing that doesn't work in terms of our storage policy management, vSphere Replication, vSAN, and SRM. So it's an easy source and target to use within Site Recovery Manager. Now we can use both products together, a vSphere replication with vSAN and array-based replication. I throw this in there because the question comes up quite often, where people say, I've got a virtual machine and I want to protect it with vSphere replication, but I also have replicated data stores. I can't do that, can I? I say, yeah, sure you can. As long as they are in different protection groups, one for your VR-based replicas, one for your array-based replicas. You can then aggregate them together into the same recovery plans, no problems. You just can't protect the same VM with both types. Mostly. That one gets a little more complex. But anyway, so SRM with vSphere replication, vSAN, array-based replication, all works, no problem. I just wanted to clarify that. So that's Site Recovery Manager 5.8. Those are the new features. Operational efficiencies introduced, new database integrated, subnet mapping, much faster recovery times.
Switch me places.
I'm sorry?
Switch me places.
Okay.
Thanks.
It sounds better from over here. That's it. So I'm going to hand it over to Jeff to talk now about vSphere Replication 5.8 and what's new there, as well as, I believe, show you some more screens, or you have a full demo? You got the full demo?
A little both. So.
Thanks.
Do a couple slides. We'll try a live demo. Always a daring thing to do. So there are some new interesting features with vSphere Replication. We've revved it up to 5.8 before. I realize a lot of folks may have already seen vSphere Replication in the past. Maybe you're using it today. Another poll. Ken did a couple polls. Quick show of hands. Anyone using VR today? So few. Okay. Although surprisingly, we get a lot of folks that haven't heard of it or seen it or even know that they have it for that matter, because it is part of the Essentials Plus kit and higher. So if you have vSphere 5.1, Essentials Plus or higher, you already have vSphere Replication, and there's no additional charge for it. It's included with that kit there, so you can utilize that to do replication, either by itself, standalone vSphere Replication as we call it, or you can use that as the replication engine for Site Recovery Manager. So again, if you're not familiar with it, just real quick highlights. That way we can move on to the demo quicker. It is a virtual appliance, actually a handful of virtual appliances, potentially, depending on how you deploy it, a minimum of one. So it's simple to deploy. It's built right into the vSphere kernel as far as the piece that transmits the bits, so you don't have to install anything on that side of it. You just have to deploy that virtual appliance as your target for replication. It is integrated in the vSphere web client, so that is how you manage it, monitor it, and all that sort of thing. You can protect any virtual machine, regardless of the operating system or the applications inside of there, so that's nice, some flexibility there. And it does have flexible recovery point objectives as well, so anywhere from 15 minutes to 24 hours for that matter. Now, best practice, I'll talk about that just for a moment with vSphere Replication. A lot of folks will think, okay, I want to protect up to 500 VMs, which is the current supported maximum for vSphere Replication. And should I set all those to 15 minutes just because I can? And the answer to that is no, you should not, because that's going to generate a lot of churn in the environment there, trying to keep up with 500 VMs and keeping that recovery point to less than 15 minutes. So the best practice is consult with your business units, your app owners, and so forth, and find out what the true recovery point objective is for that particular application. If it's only 8 hours or 15 hours or whatever that number is, then that's what you need to set vSphere Replication to. Don't set it to 15 just because you can, right? Classic case of just because you can doesn't mean you should. The other thing I'll point out too is that it is compatible with any type of storage out there. So if you're thinking, well, do I have to have matching storage on both sides? The answer to that is no. You could have traditional SAN or NAS on one side, so your source, in other words, you could replicate to a location that's using vSAN, and that will work just fine because it kind of works above that storage layer, if you will, a little bit, so it doesn't have to match. You could even do local storage. No problem there at all. Use cases. This is another one where we hear confusion sometimes. Folks think that it's automatically a site-to-site type of thing, when in reality you can replicate just about anywhere, anytime if you want to. I could even replicate to the same host for that matter. I could have an environment with one host and one vCenter and deploy one vSphere Replication appliance, and be able to replicate literally to that same host if I wanted to do that for a secondary copy, right? Traditionally, folks will either replicate within the same cluster for quick recovery. Across clusters is fine. More often we see across sites. That's where SRM potentially comes in. Again, it'll work with or without Site Recovery Manager. Across clusters, across sites, managed by the same vCenter, managed by different vCenters, it doesn't matter. All of those scenarios I just painted there will work just fine. And then one additional item you can do now with vSphere Replication is replicate to vCloud Air Disaster Recovery. So yeah, the old VCHS, we've obviously rebranded that if you've heard over the past week to vCloud Air. It has a DR service, and vSphere Replication is the engine that is used to replicate VMs from your on-premise data center up to vCloud Air DR. So quick show on the components here if you're not familiar, once again, with vSphere Replication. Again, very simple. The piece that transmits the bits for the virtual machines, right? So replicating that data out is actually built right in to vSphere. It's part of the VM kernel. It's called the vSphere Replication Agent, so you don't have to install anything. It's there by default. It's simply activated, if you will, when you deploy a vSphere Replication appliance and configure replication for a virtual machine. The second piece, and it's a required piece, is the VRMS, vSphere Replication Management Server. You'll have exactly one of those per vCenter environment. So if you're replicating across two sites, each with its own vCenter, you will probably have two of those deployed, so that way you can replicate in both directions if you want to. Now, if you're replicating a bunch of virtual machines, or you want a little bit of redundancy, if you will, you can deploy additional vSphere Replication servers, so not management servers, just VRS, and those are targets. You can optionally deploy anywhere from 0, so you don't have to deploy one of these, because the VRMS also has a VRS component in it, or you can deploy up to 9 for a total of 10 targets in any given vCenter environment there, and that's how you would distribute the load across those. It doesn't happen automatically, by the way, so it's not automated load balancing. If one gets busy, it's not going to automatically transfer the replication stream to another, but that is something you can do manually if you want to. So if you see one of your replication servers are getting a little too busy and you start seeing RPO violations or errors or issues, you can certainly go in there and manually move replication from one to the other if it makes sense to do so. I'll also get questions around consistency. How does that look in a vSphere replication environment? A lot of folks will obviously have multi-tier applications, traditional 3-tier where you have database, application server, and then maybe a front-end web server or something like that. There is no consistency across virtual machines. So if you are replicating all 3 of those, there is no guarantee that that replication is going to be at the exact same point in time for each one of those VMs there. So just something to keep in mind. And if that is a requirement, that is where you would use array-based replication and consistency groups, like with SRM, for example. Now, within a virtual machine, if you have multiple VMDK files, virtual disks, then you will certainly get consistency there. That's a mouthful. So if you have multiple VMDKs and you are replicating all of those VMDKs, by the way, you can pick and choose which VMDKs you replicate if you want. Most folks replicate them all. There is consistency there, so it will keep those VMDKs within a virtual machine consistent. Okay? Something new. Let's get into the new stuff a little bit. Something we've added here, and I chose to do screenshots here because it's actually quite easier to see up on the big screen versus in the demo environment. So I'm going to show you screenshots of the reporting, but the rest I'll do through the demo environment here. Something that has been asked about for quite some time is some better reporting. I want to see what I'm replicating, how many bytes I'm replicating across there, if I had RPO violations in the past day, in the past week, the past month, and so on and so forth. And I'm happy to report that with vSphere Replication 5.8, we have added that functionality in there. There's a couple of sample screenshots there. Again, it's easier to see up on the big screen. There's some more, so you can see the transferred bytes. My environment's in good shape, no RPO violations. And again, you can look at a weekly view, a monthly view. You can even do a custom view, something like that if you want to. And then one more screenshot for you there. Site connectivity, you can see on the right-hand side of the screen that I actually have a couple of VRS servers, so a couple of appliances that I'm replicating to, and connectivity is good there. I started with 1 and bumped it up to 2, and then you can see replication count. You can also see replication counts by host, so if you want to see that, which host is busier than others, that is in there as well. So let's jump into the demo environment here. And wish me luck, right? Because live demos, always a challenge. Number one, I'm not using fully baked code. It hasn't come out yet. You can't download it, so I don't have GA code here, so always a risk. But what I want to do first is show you replication, configuring replication to vCloud Air. So I'm going to take my virtual machine called Tech Marketing 02. I'm going to configure replication for that. Hopefully you can see that toward the back there. I know it's a little bit small. And as you can see, this is one of the new features we've added to vSphere Replication. You now have a choice of your target. Do I want to replicate to a vCenter environment, or do I want to replicate to vCloud Air DR? In this case, I thought Ken was pointing the laser at me. He's going to try to take me out.
Depends how you do, Jeff.
Keep it handy. We're a long way from done. So there we can see my vCloud Air environment. We're connected to it, so I don't have to re-authenticate, thank goodness. Nobody likes to watch people typing passwords. There's my option for storage policy. In this case, I only have one, so I'm not going to mess with that any. As you can see here, you can use replication seeds. So if you want to, they have a service where if you want to send VMDK files, seeds, to vCloud Air, I keep calling it VCHS, it's vCloud Air now, you can certainly do that. In this case, I haven't done that. Now it's a Linux VM, so quiescing is disabled. I hit next. I'm just going to keep the default policy, right? Just because I can set it to 15 minutes doesn't mean I should. Application owner said 4 hours is fine, so I'm going to keep that. Summary, and then I'm going to hit finish. And at that point, replication will begin happening to VCHS. Now I'm going to give that a little bit of time to start baking, right? Classic cooking show. You have a comment, Ken?
No, I was just going to ask how many people have...
Go ahead.
I'm glad you're cooking then, because I'm a good eater. How many people have looked at vCloud Air DR as a potential option for disaster recovery? So, okay, there are quite a few people in the audience. That's wonderful. So having this sort of baked directly into vCenter as a source integration point is a pretty nice option for those of you who are looking at it.
Now, if you're wondering what replication looks like between vCenter environments, I have that set up as well. As you can see, there's my choice again. In this case, I'm going to keep the default top, replicate to a vCenter environment. I hit next. You can see how easy it is to configure replication. You can do it one at a time if you want to, so you could configure just one VM, which is nice, very granular when it comes to vSphere replication. Or you could select a handful of VMs. So you could get a list view in your vSphere web client, you could select all of those, right-click, and configure replication for all of those VMs at the same time too. Now, if I had multiple vSphere replication servers available, I could click on this button here to select a specific server, and I could select which one out of the group. Obviously, it doesn't make sense for me to do that. I only have one. Or you can just let it auto-assign. That's fine. Target location, integration with vSAN. This is kind of cool because at my target site, I can actually select a vSAN policy for that replica. So in other words, when I recover that virtual machine, it's going to inherit this policy. In this case, one stripe, one failure to tolerate. As you can see, my only compatible data store, of course, is the vSAN data store, since that's the one that I have the policy for. I'll hit next. In this case, I can configure quiescing because it is a Windows virtual machine. Best practice number 2. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. Only turn on quiescing if it absolutely makes sense to do that, because there is some additional work that happens there too. As I'm sure you know, you have to quiet the virtual machine down, and if it's a particularly busy virtual machine, so maybe a database server or something like that, lots of I/O, quiescing that VM could take some time and potentially impact performance. So make sure you only turn that on if you need to for those particular Windows virtual machines. Here's my RPO. In this case, I am going to tighten this one up a little bit. We'll take this one down to a couple hours, something like that. And in case you missed it last year, we announced multiple point-in-time recovery. So in other words, I can have more than just the latest copy that I can recover to at that secondary site there. If I wanted to, I can keep up to 24 points in time. In this case here, the default shows keep 3 per day over the last 5 days. Maybe I want to bump that up to 4, so I could do that, and I went too far. Let's back that off. You can see the error message there, right? I went 5 for 5, and it says, well, wait a minute, 24 is the max, so total number can't exceed 24. I'm going to back off of that just a little bit. And then best practice number 3, again, just because you can doesn't mean you should. If you don't need multiple point-in-time recovery, don't enable it, because it's going to take up more disk space at the target, and it's also going to slow down recovery just a little bit as it consolidates the snapshots, because that's exactly what happens when you recover a virtual machine that has multiple point-in-time enabled. You will see snapshots on that virtual machine there, and that is how you roll back to that particular point in time, is you simply revert to that snapshot, just like you would a regular VM snapshot. You had another comment?
I was just going to jump in and talk very briefly, if I'm capable of doing that, about vSphere replication, snapshots, VSS, quiescing, and so forth. This comes up quite a bit about the concept of snapshots. Now, vSphere replication does not use snapshots on the primary object at all. We simply track the change blocks as they're being written through the filter to the disk. We grab those change blocks in accordance with the RPO on a scheduled basis, and we ship them off to the recovery site. No snapshots included in this situation. On the recovery site, that set of snapshots is basically aggregated into a redo log that then gets committed to the secondary disk. What the MPID is doing with the multiple point in time is simply retaining those old redo logs in the form of snapshots, which get cleaned up in accordance with the policy. When I say that we do not use snapshots on the primary site, that is if we're not using VSS. So one other question that comes up a fair bit for us is, if I do turn on VSS quiescing, what happens then? In that scenario, we are using snapshots on the primary site because we need to make sure that that disk is quiescent. So even more reason to be a little cautious about using VSS quiescing, because then we do start to get into the situation of using snapshots.
Yep, exactly right. Thank you. Good point there. So now that I've configured replication for a couple of those virtual machines, I can of course go in there, I can see outgoing replications, I can see incoming replications from the other side if I wanted to. And then the last part of the demo that I want to show you too, assuming I'm still logged in here, I'm going to refresh my dashboard. And this is the vCloud Air /DR, or -DR I should say. You can see this is my DR environment because they got a nice little cloud with a lightning bolt down here. Hopefully you can see that down there at the bottom. And in there are my two virtual machines, the one that I had configured beforehand and the one that is now, that I just recently configured, Tech Marketing 02. And then I can coordinate with the vCloud Air DR folks and do a test. So something that you can't do with standalone vSphere Replication is test the recovery of your VM. That is something you can do with vCloud Air DR, and of course something we've always been able to do with Site Recovery Manager layered on top of vSphere Replication as well. So that's the demo piece of it there. As Ken was talking about, I'm going to switch back over to the slides real quick, and then we're going to get to some Q&A here as quick as possible. Ken was just talking about how when you recover a virtual machine with multiple point in time enabled, we talked about how it looks like snapshots in the UI. Again, there's a quick screenshot to show you what that looks like, so very, very simple and straightforward. There's the recommendations. I already hit on these, but I wanted to make sure we left this slide in here so that way folks that download the presentation after the fact can see those and remember those so you don't have to write those down. And then one other thing I'm going to show you too real quick as I switch back over is we have a brand new, and let me zoom back out here so I can get to the tab, a brand new vSphere Replication calculator. This is something we have also heard a lot of folks asking for. Hey, at least give me something I can kind of guesstimate. And let me point out that that's what this is. It's tough to be very exact because there are so many variables that affect replication. But what this tool does here is this gives you the opportunity to solve for a couple of different things. So depending on what information you have available, you can click on this. You can either solve for network. So I need to replicate X number of VMs with this average recovery point objective across all those VMs. How much network throughput do I need? You can solve for that. You can solve for RPO. So I know how much available bandwidth or throughput that I have. I also know how many VMs I need to push through there. What is roughly that average RPO that I can get to? What's the lowest average RPO in that environment? And then last but not least, I can see how many VMs I can push through that pipe too. So I know what my RPO needs to be. I know what my network looks like. How many VMs can I fit with those particular variables there? You can enter that information, and then it will create a report for you. And see, here's the information that you enter. You can see it's pretty basic stuff. It shows you, how many VMs are you replicating? What's the average size of your VMs? How much data in those VMs? What does your network look like? So as far as latency, those types of things. And then the one that we'll probably get questions around is this largest data change burst. I don't know if you can see that there, where I'm holding the mouse over. Basically, what we're talking about there is if you have a point in time where a lot of data changes quickly, so maybe an ETL process is running on your database server and it changes a whole bunch of stuff in one fell swoop, and then we need to replicate that. We're talking about that largest burst, that point in time there. So let's say you're doing a gig of data changes per day, but maybe 250 megs of that changes all at once. That would be your largest burst there. So again, this URL will be out shortly. I'm going to blog about this as soon as we have it all set up. It is 99% done. So keep an eye on the blogs on VMware.com, and we'll have a URL out there where you can start utilizing this tool to at least get an idea. Hey, I'm going to set up replication. What do I need to think about? Again, results are going to vary though. Make sure you don't use this as gospel. It's more of a guideline because there's just so many variables, but at least we'll give you a good start. Comment?
I was just going to say that those two factors right there are probably going to be the most difficult for you to enter. What your largest data change burst is and your average daily data change rate. Does anybody know what the churn rate is on your disk, your overall amount of information. It is roughly 3% that we see on average, which is why Jeff put that into the calculator.
That's the default up there in case you didn't.
That's on average.
Right on.
I mean, that's very rare that we have somebody in the audience that actually understands what their data churn is, because it's very difficult to tell. But that affects everything, because obviously that is basically the set of data that we're replicating with any type of replication technology. So you really need to understand that, those two factors, I would say, before you can get meaningful data out of it.
Yeah, there's even little tool tips that'll pop up there too. So if you're using this and you're thinking, man, I have no idea what's kind of the average, right? Just like this gentleman here, he knows, but most folks don't. It'll guide you a little bit too. Like, well, if you're not sure, then use 3% or whatever that number is. So some nice little tool tips that are available there too. So, all right.
Why don't we pause actually and do some Q&A?
Yeah, I think it's that time. We've got about 15 minutes left. Please use the microphone. We're only going to take questions from the mic because they're recording this session. And of course, the folks that are listening to it after the fact, they want to hear the question and the answer, not just the answer. So, Ken, you want to take the first one?
Sure, it depends on the question, I guess. But
Yeah, good point.
I have a couple questions. One was the calculator that just popped up. Are there tools to pull up meaningful, customized data out of my vSphere environment? And then you talked about the reporting in vSphere Replication. Are there hooks to maybe show that information in Operations Manager?
So there are some tools in vSphere, or vCenter more specifically. For example, you could see items like how much disk is taken up by data, so free space versus how much is configured out there. You can get some of that basic information. You can also look at network information out there. But as far as a holistic view of all this just built right in, so you basically don't need that tool, we're far from that yet now. Now, that being said, you asked about vCenter operations, or vRealize, vCenter Operize, or something like that.
I think that's it exactly.
Yeah, something like that. That is definitely food for thought, and there's a lot of conversation going on around there, so I don't know for sure. But I would say chances are, yeah, we'll probably see something like that, so stay tuned on that front. Okay?
Two questions for Ken. Ken, you mentioned the VCO, new workflows. So does that mean there's a more API and new commandlets coming out, or can you talk about that?
So SRM 5.5 expanded the API for SRM. With 5.8, we're expanding it a bit further as well to do a lot more types of operations. You saw things like create data stores, create protection groups, and things along these lines. There's a handful of functionality that we haven't got out there, just about 3 different things, like creating dependencies for VMs in a programmatic fashion. I think we can do post-power-on scripts, we can do all the rest of those things. There are only a handful of lesser used things, and those are going to be addressed very, very shortly as well. But yes, the API for SRM is now expanded to include almost everything. We don't have the vSphere Replication APIs in place yet. That is something that we're taking a close look at. Fundamentally, it's a different tool than SRM, so we don't have a consolidated API set for that yet.
The quick one for VR is, are you guys considering multiple destination VR? Like if I wanted to go to, my, say, air and another place, or if I wanted to go to 2 different data centers?
So a single VM to 2 different spots? That's been asked about several times. No immediate plans for that I'm aware of anyway, but good feedback nonetheless. We'll keep considering that.
Hi, for VSR.
You mean vRealize, vSphere Replication,
I'm
SRM?
sorry, vSphere Replication.
Operations?
If it hasn't been renamed in the last 5 minutes. Can I specify a network over which I can replicate other than management from within without having to do host-based routing commands within the hypervisor?
So the last half of your sentence was the key operative there. So the answer to that specific question is no. So there are ways to do it, as you pointed out, using routing rules and so forth. Nothing built into the UI yet.
Okay.
Is anyone here using the vSphere 6 beta?
Why would you ask that?
Okay.
It's an important element in our cookie.
Second question as to the scheduler.
Yes.
I see really good performance if I have a large stack of VMs that I want to replicate. If I have, let's say, a use case of 2 VMs that are very large with very big VMDKs, the scheduler seems to choke on the calculations to be, I can't get the same speed out of 2 VMs as I can out of 20 VMs without doing some under-the-cover Have you guys worked on the scheduler for 5.8?
Sorry, is it the scheduler? Are you sure it's the scheduler? Because the scheduler is very dynamic in terms of when it chooses to start the replication. But the total throughput is still going to be limited.
I'm talking about, so the throughput would be the same. What I've seen is it looked to be, and what I understood was an artificial limit on the amount of throughput per VM. So a smaller number of VMs, regardless of their size, replicate more slowly than a larger number of smaller VMs. You guys know what I'm talking about?
I do.
Okay.
Yep.
Have you fixed that?
Not fixed it.
Okay.
But
because there's a
improvements-
hack you can do, but it's not supported.
Well, and improvements are in motion right now. So again, that Ken mentioned that just out of the blue, that vSphere 6 thing.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what he was talking about with that, but yeah. To answer your question,
So
there's gonna
can I
be-
ask a
Go
follow-up
ahead.
on that? Which version are you using today? Is it 5.1 or 5.5?
5.5.
Between 5.1 and 5.5, we made some changes as well. And I posted a blog about how we load buffers and all the rest of that stuff and ship data across the wire, and I put some unsupported tweaks that you could do. Those tweaks do nothing in 5.5. It's a wholly different set of environment variables. So if you did those tweaks, it wouldn't make a change. We fundamentally shifted it to using a global heap now for all of the replications which we load in, and those tweaks were designed around other things. But it's a much quicker replication in 5.5 than it was in 5.1. And yes, we're always looking at ways to improve how we send our data through.
Thanks.
Is it possible to protect the vCenter server itself using vSphere Replication? And if so, how do you restore it?
Well, and that's exactly it, right? Because you need vCenter to be online to do a restore. So long story short, no, there's no supported way to protect vCenter with vSphere Replication.
Any plans?
There's been a lot of conversation around that literally over the past couple of months. So there are some plans. When, if, how soon, how long, that I don't know. But it would be cool if we would be able to recover a VM without vCenter being online. That would be a great feature addition for sure. So stay tuned on that.
Thank
And
you.
there are different approaches you can take with that as well. Fault tolerance, VDP to protect the thing with backups and quick restore through that sort of lightweight thing. We're looking at VR. We're looking at other mechanisms as well. That should be out shortly.
Yeah, if you do want to protect vCenter and you need just a basic quick mechanism to do that, just deploy a VDP appliance out there. That's one of the other features that you get with vSphere is the basic version of VDP. You can back up the vCenter VM with that, and it does do some quiescing through VMware tools. So you can, if you have your database on the same VM and it's a Windows VM for that matter, you could quiesce that a little bit. Nice thing with VDP is it has an emergency restore function where you don't have to have vCenter online to restore a VM. So that might be a workaround in the meantime. Longer recovery time, longer RPO for something like that because backups only happen once a day, but a possible solution for that.
Are there any advantages of using vSphere replication over array-based replication, especially with vVols coming out as well?
So today, yeah, there are some advantages and disadvantages. One of the disadvantages I pointed out was no consistency groups, right? A consistency across VMs. But you're asking about advantages in this case, and per VM replication. So if I just want to replicate one VM, regardless of where it sits on a LUN or a volume or vSAN or local storage, I can just select that one VM and replicate that. Ease of use, too. It's very simple to configure replication. Have you ever configured SRDF before?
No,
I'm just saying vSphere replication is a little bit easier. The other thing I'll point out too is that you can go across different data stores. So with a lot of array-based replications, typically you'll have to have this similar solution on both sides. Not always, but in some cases. With VR, we don't care what storage you're using at the source and target.
that's a pretty good
If
point.
you start,
Yeah.
and if you start looking at Site Recovery Manager, for example, if you're talking about array-based replication, then you get not only per VM replication policies, but you can aggregate your protection groups by policy. Just grab any VMs that are protected by vSphere replication that you want, pull them into one protection group. It's not dictated by what LUNs they sit on and so forth, which is usually the granular unit of failover.
Got it. One other question. So once the replication happens and you can decide which VMs to shut down on the secondary side, would those, so if the DR actually is happening, would those shut down the VMs regardless of if there's compute capacity, or it will decide if there's compute capacity, so it will not shut down those VMs?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that. If
So
you're shutting
in
down,
SRM, basically you have a primary side and you have a secondary side, and you can decide, hey, in the secondary side, some of these VMs, you want to shut them down
right.
once the recovery happens.
Mm-hmm.
Does it shut down regardless?
Yes, and it doesn't shut them down though. It does a suspend on those VMs, so
I
to
see.
be very
Okay.
precise. But yes, it will suspend those virtual machines because you've identified them as non-critical.
Okay,
So
even though if there's compute.
even if there's capacity, the recovery plan
see.
itself specifies that these are non-critical systems that we want to suspend in case.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the power on operations, even if you've got lots of capacity, your memory and CPU spike when you're starting all those systems. So,
Got it.
yes.
Thank you.
So with vSphere replication, you can set multiple targets, right, that you can replicate to, because you called out like your other site and then vCloud Air, correct? So a single VM can replicate to 2 different vSphere replication servers?
No. A single VM can only go to one target,
Okay.
but I could have multiple VMs within the same environment. I can say these 2 go to vCloud Air, these 2 go to my vCenter environment, but not, you can't replicate the same VM to 2 places at the same time.
Are there any plans to add that? For instance, like SRM multi-site pairing?
It's under consideration. I don't know how high on the priority list that is, but with that question's been asked quite a bit, so that, yeah, it's definitely something we're looking at.
Thank you.
You guys talked about SRM working with VCAC, right? The integration. But if I had a vCloud Director plugged in into VCAC, is there any gotchas? I mean, will SRM still work that?
Well, thank you all for coming.
Next question.
So vCloud Director, we have a failover scenario where we can fail over the entire cloud infrastructure from one site to the other.
Right.
That's been documented, and it's out there as a PSO engagement. There are a couple of white papers around that. That is the only mechanism by which we can fail over vCloud Director today.
Right.
So irrespective of the integration with VCAC or other components, if there is VCD in the mix,
Right.
we can't fail over org level, we can't fail over provider VDCs. It's really the whole shooting match has to go together at the same time.
Right, so that will be a complete re-architecting in our environment. If we had VCD plugged into VCAC and we wanted to protect that using SRM, that would be a complete different conversation then, right?
Yes, because the VCAC auto-deploy is not assuming anything about VCD. I mean, we may be able to write custom workflows to add those virtual machines to VCD using the API to auto-import those things,
Right.
but the failover mechanism is still going to be what it is for vCloud Director.
Correct.
So we're just talking about auto-protection with the VCAC import. So we could integrate that with vCloud Director as well, but the failover mechanism is still going to remain as it is for VCD.
Okay, and for the near future, will it still be the same, or are you guys working on something on that, in that arena at all?
Near future, I can say it's going to remain the same.
Okay. Okay, cool, thank you.
Excuse me.
We'll try and make this the easiest question of the day. So right now I'm in vSphere 5.1. What's the latest version of SRM that I can go to?
From 5.1, it's actually the hardest question. Upgrade process, I believe, is 5.1 or 5.5 to 5.8. I believe we can do that.
No, my platform is vSphere 5.1.
Right.
We're barely starting to get SRM off the ground and architect it. What version of SRM can I install? Can I use 5.5 with 5.1 platform?
Yes, so SRM is tied to the vCenter instance. So if you're using, I don't know, VC 5.5U2, then you can install SRM 5.8. If you're using VC 5.1, then you can use SRM 5.1. 5.5, it's 5.5. What the platform is doesn't particularly matter. Okay. It's tied to the vCenter revision. From a platform perspective, you can even have mismatched revisions, but I would usually recommend that your failover location is the higher version, because if you've upgraded the hardware in VMware tools and you try to fail over to a lower version, you'll run into problems.
So for simplicity and safe sakes, we would stay, if both our vCenters are 5.1, stay with SRM 5.1.
You'll have to stay with
have to,
SRM 5.1,
yep.
yes.
Okay, thank you.
So can I use vSphere replication for VMware View with a full clone desktop, including connection servers or, vCenter all?
Yeah, not really supported. You may potentially be able to get some of that to work. Now, to protect the infrastructure itself, so connection servers, for example, certainly. But as far as the desktops themselves, you said full clones, right?
Yes.
Yeah, you could, like I said, you could technically probably get those to replicate. I haven't actually tried that, to be honest with you. But the problem is there's no communication between vSphere replication and the connection server. So that's great if you could replicate the VM to the other side, but then there's no awareness over there as to what's going on. So for all intents and purposes, it's not supported.
You'll need to update all the metadata associated with that virtual machine because it's now a different UUID, it might be the same UID, but it's a different MOREF and all the rest of these components. So the view manager is not going to necessarily know that this VM that has failed over is within its pool. So there's a little bit of lifting there. There is a view always on environment that is a supported multi-site, I don't know, vRealize View or vRealize vHorizon, I don't, there's an always-on architecture that is supported for multi-site view protection.
So is it using vSphere replication or some replication, or?
It doesn't particularly matter what the replication is. We're more replicating templates than we are replicating the individual VMs themselves.
And they're non-persistent desktops.
Okay.
Yeah, so good white paper, though. It's out there on VMware.com.
Just a quick question with remote offices. We started deploying remote office clusters, and one of the decisions we're trying to make is understanding if with vSphere replication, it's a requirement that we put vCenter at those sites, or if we can have those hosts report back to our main office vCenter and still replicate them to a different site.
Sorry, we're out of time. We're getting asked to close it down. Let's take some questions as we walk outside. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate it, especially this late in VMware. Thanks a lot.